Share the screen. Here we go. So the shaila that we're dealing with today is a person wants to give all of his tzedakah to his relative, to the exclusion of, of giving any of his meiser to other poor people. So far what we had seen, a quote from the Shulchan Aruch, is that you don't have a right to favor one relative over another relative. But what we can infer from that is if you only have one relative who's poor, you could, in the hierarchy of tzedakah, so the prioritization order of tzedakah, you could theoretically, you could give all of your tzedakah money just to your relatives, to the exclusion of non-relatives. Okay. But then he quotes from the Ramah. Va'od b'Ramah kasav zelushono. Aval kodam shaboli ad gabai im nadar tzedakah stam nosnin likrovav haniyim du umdan daito te kavanoso likrovav. The Ramah says that if a person pledges, let's say he says, I'm going to give $1,000 to tzedakah, and the gabbai tzedakah hasn't yet received the money, we assume that pledge is meant for his relatives. And it seems like that's the implication, that not only is that his mind on his relatives, but that he has the right to give all of his meiser to his relatives. Because of Bishut Chasam Sofer B'dvar HaShe'ila Be'echad She'isi B'no Levat Talmud Chacham. So the Pischei Tshuva brings the following question from the Chasam Sofer. He says, a man married off his son to the daughter of a Talmud Chacham. Okay, the Talmud Chacham didn't have any money, so the man, v'hitchayev litein la Talmud Chacham b'chol shavua gimel zehuvim sheyazun hazug al shulchano sheish shanim kedei sheyilmad haben eitzel chosno haTalmud Chacham hanal. The deal was that the father had agreed that he's going to every year provide 3 gold pieces. 3 gold pieces. That would be like $300,000. B'chol shavua, every year. Every week. B'chol shavua, 3 gimel zehuv, 3 gold pieces. So maybe that's like $3,000 every week, something like that. Sheyazun hazug al shulchano, and he would give this to his mechutin, Talmud Chacham. And he basically said, I want my son and your daughter to live with you for the first 6 years. Why? Because I want my son to learn with you. That's the deal. I'm letting my son marry your daughter. I'm going to support the couple by giving you the money, and you'll learn with complete economic independence for 6 years with my son. And now the Chasam Sofer is presented with the following question. The father of the groom now is saying that it's now become a hardship for him to have to come up with that money so easily. It's not as simple as it was in previous years. And he would like to use his meiser money for that purpose, to support his mechutin, the Talmud Chacham. Ve'he'ela de'im miyad b'sha'as nisuin hayadaito l'shalom mimos meiser shaper dami. And the Chasam Sofer answered, and he said that if at the very inception of the deal, at the very, very beginning of the deal, you had in mind that you were going to, or that you might use your meiser money, then it would be okay. Umikol makom mihiyos tov yichalek hameiser v'yitein chetzio la'aniyim da'alma v'chetzio livno dugma laha detaninan per ches depeya mishnavav hayamatzil v'chulei adkan l'shana. He says it would, however, be better if you only use half of your meiser for your son and your mechutin, and the other half you just give to regular people. And he says this would be no different from the Mishnah in Maseches Peah. Now, what is the Mishnah in Maseches Peah? We have to really look at that Mishnah in Maseches Peah. What does it say over there? So just bring it up. Chesvav. No, not necessarily any different from a school. We've learned before that a person has a right to use the money from his miser. Yeah. Okay, so here's Peah. Ches. Vav. So you know the mitzvah of Peah, that he says, they may not give to the poor from the threshing floor less than a half kaf of wheat or a kaf of barley. As far as any kind of tithing, you should always give at least a minimal amount of wheat to each poor person. So he says, and then this measure was stated for the priest, the Levite, and the Israel. If he was saving some to give to his poor relatives, he can retain half and give the other half away. If he has only a small amount, then he must place it before them, and then they can divide it among themselves. But the statement that you see from this Mishnah is that, let's say you have agricultural tithes that you want to distribute to the poor. You do have a right to hold on to half of it, leave half of it for the public poor, and then hold on to the other half and save it for your relatives. That's what the Chassam Sofer is bringing from this Mishnah in Maseches Peah. Now, what is the basis for this? So, if we were to look at the commentary, so the Bar Tanura says, Hayamatzil, for he does not want to distribute to the poor who came all the poor man's tithe that is in his hands, but he wants to save it for his poor relatives. No tel mechza, he hides it for the needs of his relatives. The no sein mechza, to the poor people who came, and if after he took the half and hid it for the needs of his relatives, he had a little bit, that is to say that there didn't remain to him enough to give to every one of the poor people according to the fixed measurement mentioned above in the Mishnah, he places before them what remains in his hand in order that they can divide it among themselves. But the Bar Tanura doesn't say what the basis of this halacha is. This could just have been an oral tradition that the sages had, that you are permitted to hold on to half of the tithe for the sake of your relatives. Okay. Harei mima shekasav mios tov mashma shemiikar hadin hayamutulo latet et kol hamaaser lechasano kemo shediaknu midivrei hashachanal. The fact that the Chassam Sofer says what would be optimal is to give half to the of your miser to the general poor and half to your mechutin sounds like what he's implying is that you're not obligated to. You could give all of your miser to your relative. Shim ein lo rak karov ani echad muter lo lasis kol masrosu v'laniach sharaniyim ela shechidesh lanu Chassam Sofer shebechol zeh roi lechalik chatzi me'amaiser la'aniyim da'alma. He says, yes, it would be optimal, however, according to the Chassam Sofer, to give half of your miser or half of your tithe to the general public and the half to your relative. Ulam yesh la'ayin. Ha'ima shekasav ha'Chassam Sofer miyos tov yichalek ha'maiser v'yitin chetzil niyim da'alma shayach gam kishanosein lekama krovin. He says, but what is unclear from this tshuva is that the Chassam Sofer was talking about a case where you only have one relative. What if you have multiple relatives? Would the Chassam Sofer also opine that you should only give half of your meiser to those multiple relatives. Shareach Sam Sofer Dibirakish and Kol Karovechon, Amaniach Sharanim, Demechsi Tvei Kaavla, Klape Sharanim, Avalokish Nosin Lakama Krova. And he says, I refer you to what I say later on, where we'll deal with this issue. Then he quotes the Pischei Tshuva again in a different place, and he says, Ayin b'tshuvas maram ziskin, shekasa b'shem maramitz, shekrove ishto yesh lahem din aniye iro. That your wife's relatives have the status of the poor of your city. V'lachein kasav, de'ein lachuf lebal laseis lekrove ishto kol kach kamo lekrove atzma. And in other words, we know that in the hierarchy of priority, you're supposed to give to your relatives before you give to the general poor of your community. Okay, it's your relatives come first, then the members of your community, then the general poor, right? So what about your in-laws? Your in-laws count as your relatives. My wife's mishpacha. You may not want to share this with your wife. Honey, your relatives don't count as my relatives as far as Hilchos tzedakah goes. They not win you that many points. So the question therefore is, what's the hierarchy? So he quotes from the Mara Mintz that your wife's relatives do not have the same status as your relatives. And therefore, rak shlish echa derech mashal imitain lekrova of gimel reish tes, which is, I guess, the rubles or something like that. Ein tzorech likrove ishto rak reish tes echad ad kan l'shana. So therefore, he says you only have to give, let's say, one portion out of 4 that you would normally give to your relatives. So he says if you would normally give your relatives 3 rubles, you only have to give your wife's relatives 1 ruble. So he says v'tzarachim shaharei mashma shagam keshanosin lakama mikrov of tzarach gam kein lachalek shar adiyim dahainu likrove ishtu nechshavu rak ka'aniyei iro. And he says it sounds like from what he's describing that even when you have multiple of your own relatives, you still have to give to other aniyim as well. Even if we're going to say that your wife's relatives don't count like your relatives, but he's still requiring you to give some to your wife's relatives because they have the same status as the poor of your city. So you see from there that even when you're supporting multiple of your relatives, you still have an obligation to give something to the general poor. Maybe not. Maybe I believe that the degree of closeness requires you to give more to that relative. So if it's your brother, you'd have more of an obligation. No. I'm saying just to give the simple example, a brother versus a cousin, a brother would have higher priority over a cousin. So when in your wife's family, if it's your wife's brother, he would probably take priority over your wife's cousin. But if it's between your cousin and your wife's brother, your cousin would take priority over your wife's brother. It's a bitter pill to present to your wife, so I'm not sure if you would want to share this. Ulam lahalan kasavnu shelefiho or zarua yesh chiluk bein neder litzdaka stam derashai lachalek hakol likrovav maker levei neder tzedaka avor aniyei da'alma dechayv lahaniach l'shar aniyim. He says it really also, as we're going to see momentarily in our next tshuva, that it all depends on how you made the pledge. If you made the pledge that I'm going to give $1,000 to tzedakah without specifying, so then you have the prerogative to give the lion's share to your relatives. But if you said I'm going to give this to the poor, and you didn't, the implication was the general poor, so then you have an obligation to distribute it evenly to the poor without without allowing higher priority to your relatives. שבזה חייב להניח לשאר עניים, וממילא לא תהיה ראיה מזה לנידון דינן, ועדיין צרכיין. He says, it could be that the Maram Ziskind was talking about a case where you made a pledge to give tzedakah, that this money would go to the general poor, in which case you would still be obligated to give some of your tzedakah money to the general poor, including your in-law poor. But he says that's really a little bit unclear. So he ends off equivocating. But one thing he seems to be coming out clearly is that even when you only have one poor relative, you have to give other monies. You shouldn't give all of your meiser to that one relative, but you should distribute the wealth. It becomes less clear when you have multiple relatives that you have to support from your tzedakah money. It certainly allows for a diminishing of distribution to the general poor when you have multiple poor people that you have to support. Would you, as we learned before, the general question, are you allowed to use your children's tuition to count towards tzedakah? If it's for Talmud Torah beyond a certain age, then we said that it is permitted to count it as tzedakah, but it's preferable if you don't. But if you have limited funds and the tuition is sort of breaking you, so then under certain circumstances, you are allowed to use your children's yeshiva tuition for that purpose. Okay, the next she'ela is related, giving meiser to a relative. And he writes, Reuven nosein es kol hamaser shelo likrov of Levi v'Shimon, v'heim mishtamshim b'kesef l'chol tzarchehem. Reuven is sort of working for three families, his own, Levi and Shimon, who are his two members of his mishpacha. So he's sort of feeding three families and provides for his two relatives, Levi and Shimon. Imrei nohi karoi o dilma hu chayv lases lekrov of rakavor hatzrachem ha'echrechim biyoser u'mashenisha lo yitem l'tzrachem ha'echrechim biyoser shel sharanim. And the question is as follows: is Reuven acting correctly as far as the way he gives tzedakah? He basically is providing all the financial needs for his two brothers, let's say Levi and Shimon, but then he ends up with no money to give to the general poor. So he's not donating tzedakah to the communal needs. Is he acting correctly? Or perhaps should you say that he should pull back on his donation to his relatives, provide them only with their bare essential needs, like food and rent, and not provide them with any other expenses, let them have to fend for themselves. So in that way, he'll be able to have a little bit of money left over to support the general charity causes within his community. So the tshuva is as follows. Lefi hachasam sofer, Reuven enu rashai lasis is kol ha'maser shelo l'krovav, mishum shekol ha'kedimos haksuvos b'halacha enon ela kishishneim shavim b'tzarcheim. He says, according to the chasam sofer that we learned above, Reuven would not be allowed to give all of his tzedakah money just to his relatives, because when the halacha says that there's a hierarchy of priority, that's only when you're providing, when the needs of everyone is equal. When the needs of every single individual is equal and you have one of those people as your relatives, so then you give the money to your relative first. But let's say the needs of the poor of the community exceed the poverty needs of your relatives. Then it becomes more murky. Well, krovo hazakuk l'ksus l'sha'ar aniyim hazakukim la'ochel. And therefore, let's say your relatives have they have food security, but they need clothes for Yontif. And if you recall, we learned that food takes priority over clothing, right? Because food is a more immediate need. So let's say I can either spend my tzedakah money on clothes for my nephews and nieces, or I can spend it on feeding the homeless at a homeless shelter for Jews in my community. So according to the Chasam Sofer, you would not have a right to give all of the money to your relatives because the hierarchy priority no longer applies, since the relatives don't need as much as the whatchamacallit, as the general poor. Ulam lefiha igros Moshe, Rashai Reuven lasis is kol ha'maser shelo likrov of Levi v'Shimon afilu shehem mishtamshim bo litzarcheihem shepachos nechutzim usharanim zekukim lidvarim yosim nechutzim uvilvad shelagabeim hem begeder de machzora. But we'll see a tshuva from the Rav Moshe Feinstein, who says that you are allowed to give even exclusively to your relatives, even when their needs are not as great on the priority scale as for the general poor. So let me just see if there's any. Yesh lahosif, he says, I just want to add, ki mashen echluku achsam sofer v'ha'igros Moshe zedavka im hifrish mimaiser shelo litzdaka stam. Ulam im hifrish mimaiser shelo beferish avur aniyei ha'ir zuchus karov of shona kamoshe yizbar lahalon. However, he says it all depends on how you pledge the money. If you pledge the money that it would go to the general poor of your city, so then you don't have a right to give it exclusively to your relatives. It's only if you tithe the money without any stipulation that you have a right, even according to Rav Moshe, to give all of it to your relatives, even when the needs of the general poor exceed the needs of your relatives. Okay, so quoting again the Shulchan Aruch in the commentary, he says, the Shulchan Aruch says, "Va'afilu eino beno v'lo aviv ela krovo tzarich lahadim l'chol adam ad kan l'shana." Even if the relative is not your father or brother, but let's say it's a cousin, like you were discussing, Ron, you still have to give priority to a relative over the general public. The Sham Kosav, and then the Shulchan Aruch writes, "Chayev lahakdim lahachil hara'av hara'ev milachasot ha'arum." He says you have to give priority to feed the hungry over clothing the person who doesn't have clothes. B'tzarech iyim, hayim tzarech lahakdim krovo hazokek lichsus l'sharaniyim hazokukim la'ochel. So that leaves the ambiguity open. In other words, you have two priorities. One is a relative over a non-relative, and the other priority is food over clothing. So what do you do in a scenario where your relative needs clothes and the non-relative needs food? Okay, so that's the most simple kind of sort of when you have a clash now between two systems of priority. One is the individual versus the commodity that needs to be provided. How do you make that decision? So he says, "V'hinei b'shut chasam sofer nokat dechol hakadimo saksuvos bahalacha enon ela kishishneim shavim b'tzarcheim." So the Chasam Sofer answers this. He's quoted by the Pischei Tshuva by saying that the prioritization of the people is only when their needs are equal. Ulefiza nira she'ein lahakdim krovo hazakuk l'ksus l'sha'ar aniyim hazakukim la'ochel, in which case you would not be allowed to give priority to a relative who merely needs clothes over a non-relative who needs food. Ba'ain b'shut chasam sofer kosav v'zelushono o dorish b'sifri ki yevecha evyon v'cha rot salomer ba'atzmacha hainu b'nei beso kodmim af livnei ira. So he quotes the midrashic source of how we know that you have to give relatives over non-relatives. It's based on the word in the Torah that says when there will be amongst you a poor person. So the word amongst you implies that when it's the closer the poor person is to you, the more you have an obligation to give to that one poor person. So that's how we know that members of your own family take priority over non-family members. So delahachi ksiv ki yevecha kodem evyon lomar la'aniye b'nei beso uchedoma lo amrinan ha'ta'ev ta'ev kodem ela kodem b'chol tzarchem afilu la'aniye ircha she'ein lahem mazon u'michya klal ad kan l'shona. So therefore, it seems that we do not say that whoever is hungry or takes priority, but rather relatives take priority in all of their needs over the poor of your community. So the Chassam Sofer seems to be contradicting himself. He says, because in this place he writes that relatives take priority even if their needs are not as great. So he says the way I would reconcile this contradiction is that there's a difference between B'nai Beito and Krovim. What are B'nai Beito? How would you translate B'nai Beito? The members of your own house. In other words, my wife and my children take priority over any other poor person, even if my children have food, but they need a new pair of shoes. So I can either give tzedakah to feed the homeless, or I can buy my kids a new pair of shoes. Which one takes priority? Buying your own, the members who are living, who are your dependents, those take priority. And that's what the Chassam Sofer was talking about. Ulam hakrovim she'enam smuchim al shulchano enam bichlal b'nei beso ve'ein lahaktim imhem zukukim l'ksus l'sharniyim azukukim la'ocha. But if you have relatives that don't live in your home and are not your dependents, so then you don't have the same obligation as if their financial needs are not as great. Let's say they have food, but they don't have clothing, and the other poor don't eat. Ulam beigris Moshe nakat ki masha kosta b'shulchan aruch l'chayv lahaktim lahachil haraev melakasot ha'arum zedin hanemer legabai hamamun al kupa shel tzedakah. He says, however, the Rav Moshe seems to disagree. He says that this prioritization that you give the hungry before you give the person who needs clothes is only a reference to the Gabai Tzedakah. What should he do? How should he distribute funds? Ulam adam b'tzedakah shelo rashai lahaktim krovo hazokek l'ksus l'sharnim hazukim la'ochel v'ken kosav lahedje b'shut emek she'ela deloka hachasam sofer hana. So Rav Moshe says that a private citizen can do with his tzedakah money whatever he wants. And that seems to be the prevailing attitude among the more recent poskim. It's your money, you earned it, you tithed it, do with it as you feel is necessary. The prioritizations that are listed are only guidelines, but not absolute requirements. We'll take a look, Amir Tzashem, at this tshuva from Rav Moshe tomorrow, and we'll hold it here for today. Have a wonderful day, everybody.